Well, ladies and gentlemen, next on the agenda, we move from, you know, what could have been a very heavy topic, but Professor Della did a wonderful job in breaking that down for us, to the orange economy. And no, the orange economy has nothing to do with your lunch that you're going to have at 12 o'clock. It actually speaks to the creative economy, which is something that we're very keen to learn more about, because as we grapple with our theme, global disruptions, regional resilience, we are all looking at opportunities for diversification. Prime Minister Holness yesterday would have spoken about tourism. And tourism and resilience. One of the sectors that's coming out, which is our response to the call for diversification, is the orange economy. And to lead us through that session, explain what the orange economy is, how are we applying it in the Caribbean region, is Dr. Keith Nurse. And Dr. Nurse is a principal, as you may know, of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College. That college, of course, is based in St. Lucia. He has worked as a senior economist and advisor in structural policies and innovations at the OECD Development Center in Paris. He is the former World Trade Organization chair at the University of the West Indies, where he also served as the director of the Shridat Ramphal Trade Policy Center, Executive Director of UWI Consulting Inc., Senior Fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institutes for Social and Economic Studies, and Senior Lecturer at the Institute of International Relations. And I really could go on, but Dr. Nurse, I think you're such a well-recognized, I would say, you know, figure within the Caribbean region that no further introduction is necessary. I hand it over to you to present on the orange economy, prospects for Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. I trust you can hear me well. It's a pleasure to be. Okay, I'll do that now. Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's a distinct pleasure to be invited to participate in the ICAC conference. I found your topic, looking at global disruptions and so on, to be very intriguing. I would say that the bulk of my work relates to this issue of global disruption. In fact, my PhD thesis looked at the shifts and turns in the global economy over the last 200 years. And so since then, I've been looking at how technological change has been impacting on the global economy. And I've done work in different spheres. So I'll be talking to you about my work on the creative economy and the orange economy, but I've done work on climate change, I've done work on migration, I've done work on specific sectors like the clothing and textile sector, tourism, even agriculture, but bananas, and the list goes on. I do a lot of work with countries on innovation policy, which is what I was doing with the OECD in Paris. So what I'm going to do is take you through a quick tour of what do we mean by the orange economy, and then bring it home to some Caribbean dimensions so you get a sense of where things are at. So what do we mean by the creative economy, and what do we mean by the orange economy, and where do they co-join? Well, the term orange economy was first coined in 2011 by British economist and writer John Hawkins. And he is the one who also popularized the term creative economy, which is distinctive from creative industries. And by the distinction of the use of the word creative economy, he was trying to illustrate the transversality of this element of the economy. So it is not too distinctive from how today we talk about the green economy or the blue economy. And this is where we are breaking away from the old 19th century or 18th century constructs that we inherited in the social sciences, where the focus was on putting things in silos. So in the good old days, you used to talk about manufacturing is one place, services in another area, agriculture is in another. So for example, the fastest rising component in manufacturing is the servicification in manufacturing. Right? Services in manufacturing accounts for 65% of manufacturing value added. So talking about manufacturing as distinct from services is an outdated construct. In fact, it probably never was really very useful. So what Hawkins is talking about in terms of use of the term orange economy and creative economy is how creativity has become a key driver of global competitiveness, not only of firms, but also of countries and cities and so on. And it's also how intellectual property has become a really important factor in this process. So more recently, work by Botorego, Felipe, and Marquez, funded largely through the IDB, have been promoting the concept of the orange economy. And again, here they talk about the immense wealth of talent, intellectual property, and interconnectedness. And it's important to add that last component there, interconnectedness, because it is the rise of the internet that has exploded the contribution of the creative economy. In fact, it's estimated that that as much as 70% of the content on the World Wide Web is creative content. As such, if it wasn't for creative content, the internet would be far less viable of a construct because people wouldn't be going on the internet to access all sorts of things. So it's made the internet a very viable proposition. The concept of the orange economy and so on has been spilling over into other areas. So now we talk about creative cities. So for example, UNESCO has this Creative Cities Network. It started in 2004, and they now have over 246 cities that are members of the Creative Cities Network, including several countries from the Caribbean or cities from the Caribbean. So Kingston, Santiago, de Cuba, Santo Domingo, Nassau, Port of Spain, so on. But what I want to suggest, though, is that we need to take the idea of the orange economy and the creative economy outside of looking purely at the creative arts and the creative industries. Now, Richard Florida, who's based at University of Toronto, at the business school there, Rotman Business School, argues that the most competitive cities in North America are the ones that have been able to attract the creative class. And he defines the creative class as including engineers and managers, academics, musicians, researchers, designers, entrepreneurs, lawyers, poets, programmers. What they all have in common is that they have a capacity to create new forms of wealth, and they are able to generate things like intellectual property. So a bioengineer can be defined as someone of the creative class, as well as a musician. And this framework reminds me of a meeting that I went to more than 10 years ago. It was something called Creative Clusters, and it's now defunct. But at that meeting, the Singaporeans came to make a presentation about how they had decided as a society to shift away from the manufacturing zero defect framework towards a creative industries modality where the focus was on experimentation, taking a risk, and creating a transversal economy. And they were the first country I heard speak about abandoning the old 19th century frameworks that had, to some extent, had served us well, but So I think they were one of the first countries to make a break conceptually towards this notion of a creative economy. A few years later, I was in Shanghai at a workshop with John Hawkins, and the Chinese government had hired him to help them frame and establish their creative economy. Well, I probably should have put a slide with it, but one of the biggest export surplus areas for China is in the creative economy. So China, based on figures up till 2015, 2018, China was exporting $55 billion worth of creative goods and only importing $5 billion. So they were making a massive surplus of over $50 billion worth of exports in the creative goods sector. It's one of the biggest growth sectors. So I'm arguing that the current economy is greater than just the creative economy, in effect. And it's about creativity as a key driving force of modern economies. And it's also played out in the distinction between STEM and STEAM. So for those of you who don't know what STEM is referred to as science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So for example, a few weeks ago, some regional colleagues were in my office, and they asked me, so how is your college investing in STEM? And I responded by saying, STEM is outdated. What we should be doing is investing in STEAM. And they were a bit struck by it. I said, have you not heard of STEAM? And they said, well, sort of. I said, well, the A in STEM, in STEAM, refers to the arts. And generally and historically, we have viewed the arts as something that people only do if they can't do anything really productive or profitable, or that the arts are not a really important part of the global economy. It's where people recreate, but it doesn't generate wealth. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, because one of the fastest growing components of the global economy is the ways in which art and the creative economy are being exploited. So probably the best example of that is TikTok. I remember a few years ago seeing my daughter doing some strange dances in the living room in front of her iPhone, and I was like really puzzled. And she went, "TikTok, Daddy, TikTok," and I was like, "What, TikTok?" So that's when I became aware of his existence, and I've been tracking it for the last several years. So I made a presentation along these lines last year, and at that time, TikTok was worth $180 billion. As of April 2022, TikTok is now valued at over $400 billion. TikTok is worth more than YouTube. It's almost twice or three times the valuation of YouTube. And just to put things in perspective, Zoom is worth just over 100 billion, and Zoom is its valuation is equivalent to that of the 8 top airlines in the world. So that just gives you perspective. So the creative sector that TikTok has been tapping into, as well as YouTube, are the fastest rising companies. In fact, TikTok is the fastest growing company on the planet. It's defined as a unicorn. And what are they tapping into? People's desire for to access creative content. So for example, since last year, I was looking at TikToks in terms of the app downloads. So, and I'm giving this as an example because more than 10 years ago, I was involved in a workshop at the OECD in Paris, and we were asked to think about the new dimensions in the global economy. And back then, I made the argument that we need to look at the growth of the apps market. And people looked at me as though I was from another planet. Because as far as we were concerned, what we need to focus on was still the old areas of trademarks, patents, to some extent, copyright related sectors, but not really fully embedded in that area. They were not thinking that copyright was a major area of the global economy. So 10 years have passed. If I make the same presentation as I did then, I would think I would receive a better reception now, because, for example, in major economies, the creative sector now accounts for somewhere between 5 to 10%, if not 12% of these economies. So what are the key messages? The creative economy is one of the fastest rising areas of the global economy and in global trade. So for example, in the services area, receipts in relation to intellectual property is one of the fastest growing components. All of this is being facilitated by the growth of a digital creative economy. And so what we are seeing is the growth of apps markets. We are seeing the growth of other services and intellectual property. But it's more than that. We're actually seeing the growth of what we call the experience economy, particularly as it impacts on tourism, things like destination branding. And then you also have a new growth area called intellectual property branding, which is an important element of that. So where does this leave us? If you look at Latin America and the Caribbean, our share of these markets are in decline. So even though we claim to be a very creative region, we have lots of talent, we have lots of global stars that have emerged from our region, our capacity to convert that into trade and to convert that into finance has been very weak. And that has to do with the fact that we have not been strengthening the entrepreneurial sector for these, for the creative sector, or for the orange economy, or for intellectual property. There are lots of synergies. So for example, we know that in tourism or in manufacturing or in agro industries, the design components are really important to promote and to facilitate access to new goods and services. And in many respects, what is required for the Caribbean and for many other developing countries is to have a strong trade and innovation strategy where we are able to generate higher levels of value added or global value added. So let me give an example or give an illustration of how this is working. So for example, I've been arguing that the creative economy or the orange economy has at least 5 key dimensions. And I use what I call the follow the money principle, which is that where you identify where income is being generated, and income is being generated in terms of trade and goods, which we're all familiar with. So for example, the sale of books. Imagine Amazon started off in books, and now they sell everything. But they were able to get into books, music, into film, games, video, etc., etc. So it's estimated that trade in goods, but in the creative economy, accounts for somewhere close to 2% of global trade. So not insubstantial. Services is another big area and rising, and this would include things like cross-border supply, online transactions, so ebooks, things like downloading of music, streaming of music and film, as well as gaming, are all part of this. And just to put things in perspective, gaming is bigger than film, music, and book publishing combined. And so the gaming industry is really quite dominant. Then you have trade in intellectual property. So For example, here we're talking about, of course, patents, trademarks, copyright, but we're also talking about in the area of the creative economy, things like neighboring rights, synchronization of rights, and so forth. And as I indicated earlier, this is one of the fastest rising components in global trade. And then you have data monetization. And this is directly linked to the growth of digital platforms. We're all familiar with them now. They become household names. So whether you're talking about Spotify, Pandora, TikTok, one can argue, Netflix, Hulu, you name it. They utilize creative content to attract audiences, and then they monetize the data that they collect from these audiences and sell it on to advertisers and other users. So in some respects, the creative content has become a bit of a loss leader, but it's the means by which they're able to monetize data. And then you have creative experiences. Many of the global cities have caught on to utilizing festivals and other events to brand their destination, and they've also been utilizing it to brand specific goods from their destination. So that's why things like what we call geographical indications are now becoming so much more important, because countries and cities can use that to brand their destinations. If you need to or want to understand what I'm talking about a bit better, I've a publication for the World Trade Organization where I talk about the digital creative economy and trade and talk about the strategic options for developing countries. So it's available for free downloads on the World Trade Organization website. So you can have a look at it. And I wrote it just at the beginning of COVID. So I talk about the implications of COVID for the creative sector. But what I wanted to show you was the ways in which Caribbean countries have been participating. This is a slide from the World Intellectual Property Organization, and what they've been doing is measuring the contribution of copyright industries to GDP. So look at the United States. Copyright industries in the United States account for 11% of the GDP. That's bigger than the manufacturing sector. It's bigger than the armaments sector. It's bigger than tourism, and so on in the United States. So copyright industries, which includes a broad array. So this would include everything from the advertising sector to broadcasting to software, as well as what we call the more narrowly defined creative industries: music, film, theater, museums, etc., etc. But then look at some of the other Caribbean countries I have listed here. So St. Lucia, close to 9% of GDP. St. Kitts and Nevis, over 6%. St. Vincent, just about 5% plus. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, over 4% of GDP is attributed to the copyright industries. And so that's really important to take into account. And then if you look at some of the growth trends, some countries have the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados listed here. I have some data here on the creative goods. All creative goods exports have been declining over the years. That has to do with the dematerialization that's been taking place in this industry. So for example, we used to export records and tapes, and then CDs and DVDs. Well, all of that has been dematerialized now. So it's all streaming, it's all about downloads, etc. Where we have had some growth is particularly in relation to things like festival tourism. I've been tracking the economic performance of the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival for a number of years now, more than 10, 15 years. And it's been an upward track. What we are not doing, though, is thinking about ways of how we could better monetize things like the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival or many of the other festivals in the region. So we have a very narrow conception of what their possibilities are, but the impact is quite significant. Trinidad and Tobago has one of the largest festivals in the world, as a share of its domestic economy, and it's also exported this festival around the world. In fact, it is the most globalized festival on planet Earth, and I've been tracking that as well. And then Bob Marley. So, I mean, like, what is Bob Marley worth to the Jamaican economy? So, the Bob Marley Museum is the #1 visited attraction in Jamaica. If you go to Forbes magazine, the Bob Marley estate is estimated to be worth over 30 million US, and the music catalog of Bob Marley is worth over 100 million. And in 2020, and for several years, Bob Marley is in the top 15 wealthiest dead artists. So in 2020, he was #8. So these are examples of how both creative content and intellectual property are becoming increasingly important assets that we need to be leveraging. So what's the Caribbean context? Well, the Caribbean, I think, is an interesting case study. We have lots of very interesting artists that we've produced over the years. We have interesting art forms. You just name them. So Celia Cruz from Cuba, Rihanna from Barbados, Nicki Minaj, Daddy Yankee, Calypso Rose, Eddie Grant, and the list goes on and on, many of whom have done really well for the region. I mean, Harry Belafonte, his album Calypso was the first album to achieve $1 million, a million units in sales. Shaggy was in 2005 the biggest selling artist on planet Earth, and I could go on and on and on. Right? And we have lots of festivals. I'm also making that point earlier. However, when it comes to monetizing these areas and tapping into it, we have been left wanting. And this is reflected in the data. So if you look at the world exports of cultural and creative and recreational services, Latin America and the Caribbean's share has declined between 2010 and 2019, almost by half. It means that we're not keeping up with the rest of the world. I mean, North America has declined as well. Europe has risen, but biggest growth has been taking place in Asia, mostly attributed to China. So I've been thinking, how do I get accountants to be involved in transforming this process, our way of thinking about the creative economy and the orange economy? Recently, I've been doing some work with the Caribbean Development Bank about how we can train people who work in finance how to evaluate creative projects so that they can become more bankable and so on. And what we've been doing is explaining the different kinds of funding or financing mechanisms that are at play that creative industry firms have been tapping into. So things like startup and crowdfunding. It's been done very well in North America, but also in Africa. We see a lot of companies being able to get going through crowdfunding. And then there are things like export financing, which is more traditional. Companies can get things like export rebates, trade fair support, or help in terms of their economic and marketing intelligence. And then you have debt financing, which is probably where accountants would come in to a greater degree traditionally. Things like loan guarantee schemes, interest rate subsidies, concessionary financing, microfinancing, and, for example, increasingly utilizing intellectual property for collateralization and so on. These are the areas where creative firms can benefit significantly from the expertise of accountants and bankers and so on. And then there are also areas like equity financing, venture capital, angel capital investing, as well as utilizing IP as equity. And last but not least, this is where trade support institutions can play a increasing role in terms of creating clusters and incubators and so on. So one of the things I've been working with many of the agencies in the Caribbean to do is to create the interface between creative and digital entrepreneurship by helping companies and sectors move along this flow so that they can get into startup firms, clusters, incubators, accelerators, and then ultimately into what we call market integration programs, utilizing a different array of financing mechanisms, from the crowdfunding to angel investing to debt and equity financing, trade financing, and IP financing, including branding. It's this kind of sophistication that we need to have more established in the Caribbean and the wider Latin America region. So as I conclude, what do I think are some of the roles that accountants can play? So I think this conference is a useful one because I think it's helping to strengthen an understanding of the contemporary global economy. And kudos for you for inviting people like myself to contribute. I think the link between the orange and creative economy and intellectual property is a huge growth area, which I'd want to encourage you to invest in. Some colleagues and I have already been developing tools and training perspectives in this area, and maybe that's something that we can talk about in the future. And I think last but not least, developing this understanding helps you to service new sets of clients, helping them with their business plans, feasibility plans, export plans, you name it. So I'll end on that note, and thank you for your kind attention. If there are any questions or comments, at your disposal. Thank you very much.
Dr. Nurse, thank you so very much for bringing our attention to the orange economy, and more so, thank you for breaking it down for us and ending with the very specific role for the accountant as well as the opportunities that the economy presents. We do have a few questions, and we thank you as well for being willing to field these. The orange economy is based on intellectual property and the protection of intellectual property rights, which you did allude to during your presentation. Are we equipped to protect same in the Caribbean? We have had ongoing challenges as related to copyright.
Yeah, that is, well, let me put it to you this way. It's not just about the protection of the copyright or any other form of intellectual property, it's how do you monetize it. That's the area that I'm more focused on. Yes, you need to protect it from infringement. So let me give you an example. I was doing some work in the Dominican Republic, and in the Dominican Republic, they have how many radio stations? They have hundreds of radio stations, and about somewhere between 30 to 50 television stations. They infringe a lot of copyright, at least maybe used to. And the United States Trade Representative, it's called USTR, decided to put them on the watch list for intellectual property infringement, which meant that the USTR could restrict exports of other goods from the Dominican Republic to the United States. That got the attention of the trade people in the Dominican Republic and so on, because then they couldn't export clothing and then they couldn't export other things because of this area of infringement. So infringement tends to be really high in many parts of the Caribbean. So we have many television stations in the region that are downloading or accessing foreign content from, HBO, Showtime, or whatever, and redistributing it without paying any for any of that intellectual property. So we have that, and then you have your pirates on the roadside who've been selling people's music and so on. So we have a lot of that going on. But what we haven't been doing well enough is tapping into how we can better monetize our own intellectual property. So some of it has to do with things like copyright. So a lot of our music that is played in the United States doesn't get fully captured in the methodologies that are used to calculate royalty distributions for music. And as a result, we fall through the cracks. So, which is what our biggest market. So in some countries in the region, they collect more money from France or from Japan than from the United States. So we need to find better mechanisms to collect our money in the United States. But it's also, we need to be ensuring or facilitating our firms to be able to export their goods. So we have firms from Trinidad and Tobago, let's say in the fashion industry. How can we utilize their IP or, for example, an export contract and use that for financing? So they could finance their working capital and therefore generate more exports. So for me, the bigger issue is the monetization process. Protection is important, granted, but I think we've been spending more emphasis on protection rather than monetization.
Got it. Thank you so very much for explaining that. Yesterday, as part of the conference agenda, we would have gone beyond the acronyms. That was the title of the session. And we explored the metaverse, DeFi, and NFTs, non-fungible tokens. And non-fungible tokens were presented as an option, for Caribbean artists to utilize in addressing this very same challenge. Do you see that fit as well, and using the tech that's now available?
Okay. So if you understand NFTs, non-fungible tokens, as part of the blockchain set of technologies, in fact, some colleagues and I, we wrote a paper for the World Trade Organization on blockchain and the growth of the digital economy. So that's due to come out in the next month or two. We had a launch about 2 months ago of the book. It hasn't yet hit the market. And in there, we did talk about NFTs a bit, not substantially, because we wrote that article about a year ago. And a year ago, NFTs were still being viewed as something marginal, not necessarily going to get a huge uptake. And a year later, boom, it's like exploded. So if you understand blockchain and things like cyber currencies and so on as part of a whole family, what it means then is that our financial services sector in the region is way behind the curve, because the extent to which our economies and our financial mechanisms have been digitized is very weak, one. And secondly, our forms of intellectual property are not properly inserted into our economy. So friends of mine who are artists or creative entrepreneurs, when they go to the bank to get a loan, they're still required to put up physical assets. And if they don't have physical assets, that's the end of the discussion. And so it's all great to talk about the metaverse and NFTs and so on. The question though is, what is the existing platform upon which we can jump on? So are our banks facilitating e-commerce transactions? Not well enough, one can argue, etc., etc. So the longer we remain behind the curve, the further we will, fall behind in the global economy. My favorite economist, Carlota Perez argues that development is a moving target. And so they think with NFTs is a classic example of how quickly the world economy is moving. So I don't know if that answers the question well enough, but I can send you the link to the upcoming paper when it's out.
We absolutely look forward to getting that link, and if at all possible, getting your slides so that we can share it with the attendees afterwards. But thank you so much for that. Now, I my own son just came in from doing his last CXC exam. And I wonder, how does the orange economy almost come into conflict with our traditional education system? And you sort of touched on it, where for years we've seen, okay, you're perhaps not good with the books, use your hands. You may have some artistic skills, but we see that almost as a backup to earning versus what could be potentially a main income earner. Any comments?
Of course I do. I have a son too and a daughter.
I have one of those as well.
Yeah. And
we have
okay,
APE and CSEC happening same time.
All right. So I don't know if my son will be upset with me, but so for example, my son is both a good artist and he's good at math, physics, and add maths and so on. So it's like, wow, how can you do both of those things, right? So he's now having to decide which avenue do I go. And so, for example, I've been saying to him, well, maybe why don't you look at digital engineering as a field? Because it's really a growth area. And late last year, I was in Paris doing a tour of the French academic institutions in engineering. And on the last day, they took us to visit an advertising agency, one of the largest in France. And they have 64 offices around the world. And they showed us how that their client base is in almost every sector. And the thing that they're able to sell them on is how to interface creativity into both their manufacturing processes and into their marketing, into how they're dealing with their internal stakeholders, meaning their staff, the external stakeholders, in terms of building relationships. It was quite an incredible experience to see how a very profitable consulting company was able to utilize the creative economy. So that's, I think, is one element of the equation. Well, what does this mean for educators like myself and educational institutions? So, for example, at the Southwest Community College, we are setting up an innovation hub that has 5 sub-labs. A multimedia lab, so we're getting the equipment for that in the next month or two. We are setting up an agri-tech lab, which will probably be off campus. We are setting up we're setting up a virtual reality lab, which we're getting funding from the World Bank. And we're focusing this on the blue economy, so it's going to be a virtual reality lab for the blue economy. That's what we're doing in the first instance. So we have staff who have been trained in a university in South Korea currently. A fab lab, so interfacing some of these new technologies into manufacturing. And I can't remember what the other lab is. But anyway, you get the point. Mm-hmm. We're taking training away from the generic classroom setting to a framework where people are learning by doing. So we're buying drones, 3D printers, create what we call a maker space. So Caribbean education is still very outdated, of course, but it's still premised on chalk and talk. Mm-hmm. It's premised on rote learning. it's premised on passing exams. That does very little for creativity. The world is not buying that anymore. That's the past century. And particularly in the colonies, all we had to do was follow orders. We didn't have to create new templates. And so the whole colonial educational structure was premised on our young people, well, just showing up to work and being able to follow orders from somebody on top. And most of our institutions still operate like that. So the concept of the boss is not a leader. The boss is somebody who tells people what to do. And staff are people who don't do anything until somebody tells them what to do. All right, so there's zero creativity going on there. And that's why our firms are becoming increasingly uncompetitive. I mean, if you look at the data for the Caribbean, our share of the global economy has shrunk massively in the last 20, 30 years. And that's because we have highly uncompetitive firms with very little creativity. We don't spend any money on research and development. We're not doing any innovation. Our debt load has skyrocketed. It's what, 80% of GDP before COVID. Yeah, we're in an existential crisis, whether we are aware of it or not. And I'm saying a lot of it has to do with the way we conceive ourselves as a people, and then our educational institutions are part of the problem and not necessarily part of the solution. And this, you're talking to somebody who's an educator, right? So I've been doing this for 30 plus years, and I'm fundamentally aware of its severe limitation in the way in which it's hamstringing our economies and societies.
Dr. Nurse, thank you very much for that perspective. And of course, our absolute kudos and well wishes for all that you're doing at the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College in terms of modernizing the offering and definitely catering to our current generation. Yesterday as well, we would have spoken to the new generation of accountants. And, you know, it was an interesting conversation in terms of their needs and what currently exists. We do have a question that came through via the Wova app. How do we get some of our islands to collaborate on monetizing our orange products?
Okay, yeah, so one thing we've been trying to do over the last decade or more is create more industry associations at the regional level. And often it hasn't worked. So it's only in a few areas where we've seen some regionalization taking place. Because each one of these islands or territories, if you include Suriname, Guyana, Belize, and so on, are too small in their own right. They don't have enough critical mass. So it is really incumbent on us to break out of our silos and create regional, let's call it regional public goods. In the Inter-American Development Bank and at the World Bank, they talk about creating regional public goods. So this is where we need to have a stronger push, even also to facilitate the growth of industry associations within countries. So some countries have done fairly well. So in Jamaica, to some extent, the Jamaica Federation of Musicians been around for a long time. In the Bahamas, they've been around even the longest, since 1948. And what's interesting is that they've been able to get certain things embedded in policy that haven't been replicated elsewhere. Okay, yeah. So so like in the Bahamas, they've been able to get to ensure that for every foreign artist that's performing, a local must also perform at a particular concert or whatever. And they also require, it's also required that the hotels commission work from local artists. And so it has benefited some of the Bahamians. But that model hasn't been replicated in other parts of the Caribbean. So we need to be strengthening that kind of thing. I am the chairman of Caribbean Tales Worldwide Distribution. We're the largest distributor of Caribbean film in the world. We've been running an incubator for filmmakers in Toronto for the last 12, 13 years now. And we've been positioning filmmakers to go global. And so we also need that kind of experience where we have incubators and accelerators that help entrepreneurs step up to global standards. So those for me are the two key areas or approaches that we need to adopt: industry associations and more incubators and accelerators.
Excellent. Dr. Nurse, we want to thank you very much for your time and your sharing today. There's a comment, a little bit tongue-in-cheek in WUVA, but I'm going to share it with you. Thank you, Dr. Nurse, for clarifying how far behind our banking infrastructure is and how it will impact the orange economy. Any comments?
Well, the Caribbean Development Bank had organized earlier this year a workshop where we brought together people from all the various banks, both private and development banks, and trained them on how to evaluate creative industries, products and services, and intellectual property. And so we've created a master course, a master class that is now accessible through the Caribbean Development Bank. So we are starting to make some headway. Yeah, all is not lost.
Progressive. Thank you so very much for sharing that update. A little consolation to the rest of us listening on. Dr. Nurse, thank you so very much again. And of course, if you can share your slides, we will share it with those participating. We wish you an awesome weekend, and we will be looking out for that book. Just so you know, one of the sessions after lunch deals with the blue economy. Which would be led by Mark Hill, who's the CEO of Export Barbados. So we're loving the synergies, and I keep calling this, I have titled it myself, I should copyright it, the kaleidoscope economy that we are seeing right now emerging in the Caribbean region. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the first half of our second day, and this is where you get to, take a break, enjoy your lunch, digest all that has been presented thus far. Reminder, of course, that we resume at 1 p.m. promptly, and at that time, Nancy Foran, who is the founder of ESG Partners Inc., would be sharing some ESG insights. As I mentioned, Mark Hill will be expanding upon the blue economy. And then Charlotte Pugh, who is a senior manager, climate change and sustainability services at EY, will be speaking to us. And I know Charlotte intends to make us accountable on the role of our organizations and ourselves as related to climate change. Once again, this conference is brought to you courtesy Ernst & Young, EY, as well as CPA Canada and the Barbados International Business Association, who offers you a very early invite to the Insurance Risk Management Conference that they're having in March of next year. Enjoy your lunch. Be back at 1 p.m. Thank you.